Hey, we are here with the Welcome Back Pat episode of the MMA Prospectus. The show hasn't been, the show took a short hiatus, but Pat was gone last week too, so this is his official return to real solid media and MMA discussion. The height. I know this is the big thing that he looks forward to every week. Um, and we're here to talk prospects again. I'm joined by Tom Grant and Patrick Wyman. As always, I'm Zane Simon. And we got a big card, 187 to talk about, a few fights from Manila to talk about, and even last week's Bellator because that was like the prospect heavy card from last week. Um, Other than that, not a lot of big stuff. You're getting the frantic last minute version of the prospectus because, frankly, my day has just been a mess and I haven't had time to put together a more well constructed show. I think I told somebody that we might look into something for them, but now I can't even remember what that was. So, fuck it. If you made a request of me over the last week, today that request is garbage.
Oh
Anyway,
god.
Pat, what have you been up to? Thanks for coming back.
No, it's good to be back. I was gone for an entire week in Washington D.C. Having fun. I quit smoking, so
Oh,
that's a big thing. Big steps, big things happening. And then last weekend I went home to see my parents. So also that.
so
Yeah.
really you've just been like an international man of mystery. That's, I think, what we can say and take out of all that. And by international, I
I
mean
don't
in
know if
the
there's
U.S., and by mystery, I mean taking trips that are, you know, standard.
Yeah, I mean, I literally just told you everything that happened. Like, there's no mystery there. Actually, the only mystery was how I got stuck overnight in Seattle once again, and once again, my flight was too early for us to go have a beer.
You know, I don't even think you were. The worst part is I don't even think you remembered that I live in Seattle. I think that's what hurts the most.
Of course, I remember that I live in Seattle. Jesus Christ! God, what do you take me for, Zane? Some kind of pugilistically dementia. God, I'm not helping myself here, am I?
No, I was gonna say I think you pretty much hit the nail on the head.
Digging around in the word bag didn't help your case there.
Okay,
So,
so we're
digging
obviously we're welcome back to Pat Wyman Charity Radio. We're here to raise just as much money as we can for our poor soul.
No, I'm
If you
sorry. I'm kind of burnt. Like my shameless plug piece that I was working on for a really long time finally went up on Deadspin, and I was kind of a mess about it the last couple of days.
All right. Well, maybe that's a reasonable excuse for you to have. Otherwise, if we'll put a phone number at the end of the episode. People can call in if they want to make a small donation. We're going to start passing the hat to make sure that Pat gets the care he needs later in life. Uh, Tom, you're with us here as always. That was, you don't get quite the same loving intro that I've given Wyman here, but thanks for returning one more time and bringing dogs with you because that always ups the ante here.
Oh, yeah, I'm coming to you live from my parents' basement because I'm dog sitting tonight for my parents. So yeah, I'm putting up with my dog is actually the one crawling all over me right now, and I'm putting up with their terrible Wi-Fi with like an ancient like Apple airport from like 2005. So if I suddenly drop out, that's why.
Great, live from his parents' basement. This is already going so well. We've
Yeah.
got we're hitting on all cylinders. So we're
Well, I don't think it hurts to emphasize once again that the MMA Prospectus is in fact a dog-friendly show. I believe that all of us have at various points had a dog on our laps as we've recorded.
it's
So
true.
love us for that, audience, is what I'm saying.
Yes, if you can't respect us, love us for our love of animals. I think that's really what we're saying.
Yeah, yeah, correct.
Um, in the meantime, we've got a couple of fight cards to talk about. The big one is UFC 187. But before we get into that, I kind of want to talk about the Manila card from last week. Just because some shit happened on that card here and there, A few people showed up, put on good fights. I know neither of you guys saw the Nolan Tickman fight, but just to get that out of the way, he probably got robbed, but he fought to lose. He fought a very unjudging, friendly style. I remember before the decision was read, I was just like, Jiqui has a serious chance for a Diego Sanchez like decision here, and lo and behold, that's what he got. Um, Other notable performers were surprisingly Ning Guangyu looked pretty decent. He's actually improved a bit, but Royston Wee also looked like probably the worst fighter on the UFC roster, so that doesn't say a whole lot for him. And Diego Lima has basically panned out, totally shot his UFC career down the toilet at this point. That I think
Yeah,
was
but
the
you know who
biggest
looked
surprise.
awesome?
What?
Yeah, you know who looked awesome if Diego Lima looked terrible? Li Jingliang is
Yeah,
actually a legitimately good fighter, is by far the best from a technical perspective, the most skilled fighter to ever come out of China. He looks awesome. Like
yeah,
he's super durable and he's super game and he throws combinations and like he can hit really fucking cool takedowns. He's got a really cool throw from the wizard that he likes. Like he's got a really interesting skill set and he's talented. Like he's a legit talented dude.
yeah. What impresses me the most about him was that he came in off the regional scene known almost purely as a blanketing grappler. Like, he had the
Mhm.
nickname the Leech for a reason, and that's because he was known that he would cling on to you and he would wear you down until he got submission. And in the UFC, like, he's realized he doesn't have the takedown chops to make that work anymore, so he's actually invested in his striking and, looking to make his striking the center point of his game, and it's actually kind of working, you know? So,
Yeah, I
he
mean,
deserves a lot of credit.
I actually, yeah, I think he's actually like a legit promising fighter who could. I mean, he's not going to be elite, but like he could easily be a top 20 fighter, especially if he could somehow make the cut to 155. I don't know, that would be tough, but he would be a big lightweight, and his skills would play really well in that division.
Yeah, and that
It's
pretty much
true.
already makes him like the best fighter out of China that the UFC has at this point, like legitimately out of China.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, Wang Tsai was out of Mongolia, but he was their other really the guy who looked like he had some real talent that's now looks to be gone. He just got, I don't know if he just stalled out his contract because it wasn't paying him enough, or if he's just doing what a lot of fighters do in that part of the region, which is realize that there's not really a whole lot that the UFC can hold them to if they want to take fights in China and fight for somebody else. I mean, the UFC doesn't have a lot of recourse to call this Chinese fighter out of China and tell him that they're gonna like sue him or
Yeah. Yeah, this is true. I mean, if the U.S. government can't, if U.S. corporations can't sue Chinese corporations for intellectual property theft, like the UFC probably ain't going to be able to do much to Wang Tsai if that is indeed the case. If it wasn't that his contract was up.
yeah.
So, what did you guys think of John De Los Reyes?
I think like I saw what I want to see out of him, which is that he's an action fighter with power and some decent fluidity in his hands. But I don't know like how far that much further that's going to carry him, and I'm not sure that I saw anything else against Song Chan. That was like he looked good, but I mean, he didn't look like not the guy who got beat by Kyoji Horiguchi.
Yeah,
Tom?
I think it was a good fight for him in the sense that he was bouncing back, but I would need to see him kind of back in there with. I mean, because he got a rough welcome to the UFC. I mean, in Dustin Kimura and Kyoji Horiguchi. So this was kind of like a bit of a step back fight for him and kind of see where he's at. And he's clearly, I mean, he's headed in the right direction in that sense. But I think his next fight, they'll probably give him something a little bit more in line with like the middle of the division as opposed to kind of like a guy who's on his way out of the UFC.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think any of us are under the impression that De Los Reyes is going to be like an elite fighter or anything, but he is a fucking specimen, huh? Like,
Yeah,
super huge, strong, fast, hits really hard. looks like an athlete. Like, he's really well put together in terms of the way that he moves, but his skills, especially on the ground, are terrible. Like,
Yeah.
oh my God. Like Tom, were you just laughing your ass off during the grappling exchanges in that fight? Because I was, and I'm not like super technical in terms of my knowledge of grappling, but even I was like, that's like wow, that's not how that's supposed to work.
I mean, I expected more of that level of grappling when we went to the Philippines. And to be perfectly honest, like on the undercard, like we're going to the Philippines, I kind of expected a lot more of that. And I'm a little shocked that the dude out of the U.S. was the one providing that level of grappling.
Yeah, I think the biggest question that I have for De Los Reyes really is like, is he a prospect? That's the thing that like he's the fun fighter and he's a fun action fighter, but he's a guy who's fought with relative consistency since 2008. And it may be one of those things where it's just like a really great physical athlete who has never been with a good enough camp to hone his skills beyond a few basic tools, and maybe at this point too far in to really change. I mean, it could be going to, if he can get himself to a really good camp. I don't know where yeah, he's at Counter Shot MMA, so
Which is in
Guam.
Guam. Yeah.
Yeah, so
By
at
the way,
that
being
point,
in Guam, not an excuse for having terrible grappling, because Mike Fowler's got a jiu-jitsu school in Guam, man. Like, get over there.
yeah,
Yeah.
fun fighter. He's definitely like deserves to be in the UFC. I'm glad he's there because he has the athletic ability to be there. But win one, lose one kind of fighter, I think. The big person I was
I mean,
impressed with. Oh, sorry.
no. I'm good. Go ahead.
I was gonna say the person I was really more impressed with and more excited to see in the future is John Tuck. He's the guy
Mm.
that put on the kind of fight where I think that was a career-changing win for him, and that it's the first time I've seen him in the UFC where he didn't look physically outmatched, and against a strong fighter, like against somebody powerful and physically competitive, he didn't look like he was the weaker fighter in there.
Yeah, Bang is deeply flawed as a fighter, but he's still big and physical, and he hits hard. And yeah, and this was legitimately the first time that I think Tuck has not looked physically overmatched. Like, even when he fought Jake Lindsay, who's not exactly an elite fighter by any stretch of the imagination. Even then, Tuck was getting pushed around in the clinch and all of that. And Tuck looked like he put on a lot of muscle. I mean,
Yeah.
you could make whatever kind of inference you want to about that. I'm not going to say anything explicitly, but for the first time, Tuck really looked like he belonged physically with UFC caliber fighters. Because I mean, his skills. You could always raise some questions about his skills and like his strike selection on the feet and what he wanted to do there. But this is the first time he's looked like he was physically able to play the kind of game that he wanted to play.
Yeah. And at that point, like, there is a chance that he could rise up to that, like, Anthony, at his peak, Njokuani action fighter level where, he's one of the most dependable action fighters in the UFC. Or Melvin Gillard would be, like, a good example. When Melvin Gillard was, like, you knew you were going to get a good high-level action fight out of him. Like, that's what you want to see somebody like Tuck develop into,
Yeah. He does have talent.
Yeah,
He really does.
definitely.
And he always has.
It's just this is like I feel like there's a lot of that on this card, and like out of a lot of the Asian guys, and I think we'll see more of it too with the Latin American prospects, is you get guys that are going to be like they've got some stuff they do well, and then a lot of stuff has to go right to turn them into a fighter that could actually make an impact in some way. And Tuck seems like one of the few guys that is kind of turning that corner and going from a guy who had the physical talent or who had some of the skill but just wasn't quite ready for the UFC.
Yeah. Like
big prospect. You're a little delayed.
Oh
Go
yeah,
ahead.
sorry. Something that comes to mind on that front is we're looking ahead at UFC 188 in a few weeks. Like Yair Rodriguez, who won the Ultimate Fighter Latin America, speaking to exactly your point, saying like if they wanted to build him slowly, they could, and they might have something there. Like he's
Yeah.
raw, but he has legitimate skills. Instead, they've thrown him in with Charles Rosa, who's probably going to submit him in the first round. Like
Yeah.
these guys like this are long-term investments, not short-term investments, and they need to be booked as such. Like moving up the card a little bit for the Philippines fight night, like Mark Ediva is a really good example of that. Like that's a legit talented guy. He's got great physical tools. He's a solid striker. All he needs is time and some favorable matchups, or not favorable, but just like book him against lower level guys, and you could end up with a guy who could be not a headliner or something like that, but he could be a top 15 fighter.
Yeah, Diva did a lot better in his fight than I thought he was going to. He was much more game than I expected him to be, and it ended up being kind of a grindy fight in a way that I wasn't expecting. I was expecting Diva to get kind of tuned up on the feet, to be perfectly honest, and that really didn't kind of come about. And I thought it was a good fight for both prospects, and that they both got some quality cage time in against like level prospect. They're kind of in similar developmental stages, and they both kind of came away with a lot of positives and then also indications of what they need to work on.
Yeah,
what were your thoughts?
I definitely.
Sorry.
I mean, I think that was a fight that was decently well booked in that it shows. Makashvili is really the fighter that we want to see Makashvili develop into a blue chip kind of guy. Like he's the guy that we expect to be top 10 at some point in the future. And Adiva gave him a tough outing, showed his holes, showed what Makashvili needs to work on, but also gave Makashvili the kind of fight that he had an easy avenue to win it and stay ahead. So I'm glad to see that from Makashvili. I mean, on the same sense, like I want to see them build some guys like Adiva, some of the regional guys they're picking up who need experience, but I also want to see them build guys like Makashvili and get him the kind of wins that he can really learn from, and I feel like that was a good start for him. And Adiva looked all right. It sucks that he's on an 0-2 streak, and I hope they keep Adiva around because he's definitely one of the better technical talents out of that part of the world.
Yeah, I mean, kind of in general, I was impressed with the quality of the fighters from the Philippines, and I have been generally fairly impressed with that since they started signing them. Like if we're kind of looking to draw similarities between them, they all have really good physical tools. Like that's true of that kid Roldan Sanchan who fought John De Los Reyes. They've all got good physical tools. They're all, if not really what you would call elite MMA strikers, they all have interesting striking styles for MMA that could work. Better wrestlers than you would expect. Pretty raw on the mat. But in terms of those two core skill sets, they're all pretty solid.
Mm-hmm.
There's stuff you can work with there. Certainly farther along than fighters that they've brought in from other parts of the world.
Yeah, it's farther along than Mexico. I mean, I would say that it's a good deal further along than Mexico or Latin America.
Yeah, I would agree that the Filipino fighters are proving to be adjusting surprisingly quickly to like the modern MMA metagame in a way that like we're seeing fighters from like Japan struggling to do so and things like that. So it is surprising how quickly they're picking it up. In an area of the world where there's not exactly like a lot of I'm not sure there's much structure to what's going on there in terms of professional MMA otherwise. So I know there's a lot of martial arts in the Philippines. Like there's a whole section of the martial art world just kind of designated as Filipino martial arts. And I'm kind of surprised to see how well like that culture is kind of like turning into MMA in some ways. In some ways where like there's like a larger resistance to it in China, where like the Chinese martial arts community isn't really embracing MMA, and I'm not sure the Philippines are so much embracing it, but like they're getting pretty like well-tuned fighters out considering how young the sport is there.
Well, I think a big difference in that too is really that like the Philippines seems to be a fight fan country. Like and obviously like you say the same thing about Thailand and a lot of Southeast Asia, But the Philippines, like, obviously they're big boxing fans. We know that. The country shuts down for Pacquiao. But they don't have quite the same sense of like, like this is our sport that we're trying to protect, like Thailand does, and like some of the other countries down there do, where they're like, we don't want MMA because we've got to protect our other sports. It's more like whatever combat sports we can get, we're interested in and interested in competing in, and we're interested in watching. That feels more like what you see there. Like, the fans were just absolutely ready for that show there, and we're really excited for it. And I think that's the kind of country where if the UFC makes a minimal investment, they'll probably get a maximum return. That's unlike some of the other countries out there where they're gonna pour money in and get very little out. It feels like the Philippines, they're more maybe like Poland, where it's just like you don't have to put that much in to get a lot out of it.
Yeah, the Poland is actually probably a pretty good comparison, wouldn't you say, for the Philippines? Like,
Yeah.
I think Polish fighters are further along than Filipino fighters are, but in terms of the size of the market, in terms of the saturation of of relevant martial arts into society, and the willingness of the fan base to attend events and spend their money on it, seems like there's a fair bit of overlap there.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's just kind of like it sucks. It says something kind of bad about the UFC, maybe, that they haven't taken a view. They've taken the view of what are the countries that would look good to get under us and to get on our side, rather than what are the countries that would actually make sense to go out and invest in and get on our side. Like, it looks good to be in China. It looks good to try to, it seems like it'd be a good thing to get into Mexico. Like, they've got a lot of boxing fans, and it's right next to the U.S., and we could get in there like we have Canada. And it's just like, well, maybe look at the countries that are actually really primed to be invested in and have like a market of fighters that are ready and are waiting and are, like Ukraine, for instance. Although obviously that's very unstable, but that's a country where the UFC probably wouldn't have to put a lot into Ukraine to get a lot out.
Yeah, it's one of those things, and I've had a theory about this for a really long time. This might be a bit of a digression from our normal topics of discussion, but the UFC, like a lot of businesses that operate internationally, tends to just transpose its business model from one place to the next, and it tends to elide differences between different places and the different cultural groups to which they're trying to appeal. They don't really pay all that much attention to those differences or try to understand them in any meaningful way. And a lot of the time they're right. Like, a lot of what they try does work reasonably well from place to place. You try and build off a local star or two. You try and do X kind of events with X kinds or with Y kinds of fights, and for the most part, it works reasonably well. But then when you see the limits of that approach when they try and go to a place like China, where they just completely fail. And I can't imagine how much money they lost trying to break into China. But from what I've heard, they lost a substantial amount of money trying to get in there. I mean, that was a clusterfuck from beginning to end. And so, I have a feeling that if and when they try and go into Russia, they'll have similar kinds of problems.
Yeah, Russia's a tough market.
And I think early on, the UFC did just that with in terms of like locating the markets that they were going into. I mean, like, going to England was very much based off of interest they were seeing in the sport. And I think, despite the fact that the English market never like exploded, or maybe it did in the sense as much as a market that small can explode, but I mean, we see a lot of fighters out of England now. Like, the Northern European MMA scene is flourishing, and I think a lot of that has to do with the attention that the UFC paid to England very early, like in the middle of the MMA boom. They paid England quite a bit of attention, and now I think we're seeing the fruits of that with kind of like peripheral areas developing their MMA scenes, and very much like the idea of Ireland kind of developing an MMA scene. And I feel like they kind of did the same thing with Australia, where they kind of followed the interest there. And I'm not sure we're seeing like the same amount of payoff out of Australia, but it is something that they can reliably go back to once or twice a year, do a show there, and they get a couple of solid fighters out of there every so often. And I do agree with you guys that we've kind of gotten away from that. I mean, like the China experiment. I mean, there was like no. I mean, like obviously we're not seeing the information the UFC is seeing, but like just all of us were kind of in like MMA fans and media were just wondering what the heck they were doing, because there wasn't like a huge influx of fighters from China, and as previously stated, like the Chinese martial arts, like established martial arts community, actively resisted MMA kind of coming to that country. I mean, it was very much kind of pushed away. So it does seem like the UFC is kind of targeting areas where like the Philippines and Poland and areas of Eastern Europe would be a fantastic place for them to promote, but they're very likely going to go after the big fish who are kind of very much coveted and sought after, but very difficult to land.
Yeah, I do like they've it's like that India idea they kept throwing out for years. That feels like that's just a money pit to be made. That it would be exactly as bad as China if they try to do that. It seems like one of those markets where the entertainment interest, and that may be unlike China, which was so closed off. The Indian market may not be closed in that same way, but the entertainment interest just seems so different and so different than what the UFC has to offer. Like, it just doesn't seem like it's a mark. It seems like a place that the UFC could pour a whole bunch of money in trying to develop something that's just not there.
Yeah, and it's something that, like, and again, I think Pat brought up a really salient point in the idea that the UFC doesn't adjust their product for anywhere they go. Like, the biggest concession they'll make is they'll load up a card with, like, they'll bring in fighters of that nationality for a card, especially in the undercard, but they really don't change their product whatsoever. And, I mean, when you look at companies that have had success internationally, like, one of the like case in point, if we're going to just totally switch business models and talk about like McDonald's, I mean, on a fundamental level, they utterly change their product depending on what country they're in. And the UFC doesn't do that. And it'll work some places, but that approach won't work other places.
Yeah, there's a very real sense that the UFC is kind of the McDonald's of MMA in some ways, and but without like the savvy. That just made me a little depressed. Anyway,
Lacking the savvy of McDonald's, that does sound kind of rough.
I think the only other thing I wanted to touch on before we got off of this Manila card, which, to be honest, didn't maybe deserve as much time as we spent on it, was Luke Barnett. Like, I realized he wasn't a blue chip prospect, but man, that seems like the case of a fighter going exactly the wrong place before his style had developed. And now he's like there. I think there are some camps that can really develop a fighter technically, and then there are some camps where it's like this is the professional place that you should go once you've been in for like 4 or 5 or 6 years, and now you're looking to get like that consistent UFC level environment where you're gonna always have the people there to help you cut weight, the people there to spar with you, the people there to control your camp. At some point you need that. But it's to start out you kind of need like the coaches that are going to give you the really individual attention and help teach you everything. And it seems like Luke Barnett going to Alliance has really undone more than it's done for him.
So Connor and I talked about Luke Barnett on this week's episode of Heavy Hands because we were talking about guys who are fighting against type, right? That that your style is a matter of your personality and your temperament. And if you look at Luke Barnett's first few fights in the UFC, like when frankly he didn't know enough to be worried about what exactly it was that he was doing. When he was up doing his camps with Chael Sonnen and Clayton Hires and those guys up in the Northwest, and then doing some work at home, like Barnett is quite clearly by temperament a pressure fighter. He wants
Yeah.
to be pushing you backwards, and he wants to be moving into the pocket behind his jab and hitting you with knees and messing with you in the clinch. Like, that's the way that he wants to fight, is kind of in your face, despite the fact that he's 6'6". But when you look at Barnett's last few performances, it's clear that they're trying to get him to be kind of a standard outboxer, like where they're like, well, you're 6'6", you should just be at arm's length at all times. And it's clear that it just doesn't register with Barnett. And like when he's fighting that way, he can't pull the trigger. You know what I mean? Like you look at how his output has dropped off. He's throwing a third or a quarter as many strikes per minute as he used to. Like and I've talked to some people who have done some work with him there or who have seen him training, and like they all pretty genuinely think that the environment's bad for him and that it is actively making him worse as a fighter. And like you just can't make somebody fight in a way unless you're Firas Zahabi and you can literally just break somebody of their habits because you're that kind of dude. And he was very clear that he thinks he's that kind of dude when I interviewed him. But like most coaches can't do that. You kind of are who you are, and it's up to your coaches to bring that out in the most effective way possible, rather than trying to fundamentally reshape you into something that may not suit who you are at the core.
Yeah.
I very much feel when. Oh, sorry. I
sorry.
was just saying. I very much feel that Alliance is one of those gyms that kind of they kind of have like a set style of striking that they try to teach all their fighters. Like all their fighters become out fighters to some degree or another. And a lot of their guys also kind of fall into the trap of trying to, like Dominic Cruz being the most successful fighter out of that camp. A lot of them fall into the trap of trying to emulate Dominic Cruz's style or talk about trying to replicate his success on the outside. And you end up seeing guys kind of enter this regression. I mean, like the one I think of most clearly is Phil Davis, and kind of seeing we're like, oh, he's become a more technical striker, but he's a dramatically less effective fighter now because it kind of took away what he did best and has kind of forced him to fight in a way that's very like against what he was early in his fight career. And I feel like Alliance is one of those gyms that like you need to be a particular type of fighter to succeed there. In the sense, like I think in other sports we would call them like their coach like a system coach. Like you need very specific types of athletes to come to you to like implement that. And I kind of feel like that's where Alliance is, where they're very much like a system gym, where they work a very specific type of fighting that works for some fighters but isn't necessarily fit for like every athlete.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of things about Tony Palafox, who runs the striking for most of those guys. And while what he does clearly works well for some of them, on the whole, I've heard pretty negative things about him as a coach. And I tend from people who I know fairly well and people who I know have been exposed to other striking coaches, like elite striking coaches, and according to them, Palafox is really, really not on that level. And so, I mean, take that as you will. That could be wrong, and maybe what he does works for some guys. But I think in Barnett's case, we have a pretty clear example of it not working. Like it just could not be more obvious that he's uncomfortable and it's just not going to fly.
Yeah, I mean there are maybe 3 top camps I can really think of, maybe 4 if I include Novo now as well, that I can think of where I can think of like this is a place where you can go from 0 to 100 in your career. Like you can start at the bottom and stay with this system all the way through, and it will turn you into a great fighter. You know, you're talking about Sarah Longo, you're talking about Black Zillions, you're talking about oh, what was the other one? Shit.
No, yeah,
TriStar.
yeah,
Nobu now.
TriStar.
You're talking about TriStar. Like those are the kind of camps where you can start in that system and stay in it, and you're gonna keep. You know, they're gonna develop you into a very, very good fighter. But for a lot of camps, like they don't have the kind of identity where I'm like, oh, he's got that, AKA striking. Like I don't, I mean, or ATT, where like, yeah, there's an identity there maybe, but it's not one that's so strong that I would be like, oh yeah, obviously if you go to ATT, you're gonna learn to, kick like Thiago Alves or something. And for some camps, it's just like they, with the guys they get from it, the point, they're the very beginning of their career, they really don't seem to build very good fighters. Like they just make guys into a very specific style that doesn't turn out that great, and it's not something that I would then point to and be like, that's what you should be. That's where you want to start. You might go there eventually, like the amount of fighters that go to Jackson Winklejohn, obviously there's something worth going there because you're going to get great training partners. You're going to get somebody to teach you to cut weight right. You're going to get an environment that's going to keep you motivated and get sponsors and get all the things that come with being associated with a whole bunch of other top tier fighters. But maybe start somewhere else. Like get, get the early part of your career under your belt somewhere where you have a coach that is really technically focused on improving very specific basic skills.
Yeah, you actually hit on something because I came into the show today when we transitioned to the UFC 187 card planning to talk about an AGT and Alliance comparison, kind of looking at the two prospects that AGT has going on that card and saying they remind me very much of kind of Alliance fighters, kind of in their development in Colby Covington and Justin Scoggins, and kind of their, like, the way they fight, the way they both seem to be kind of being like, they very much play on the outside striking wise, and in Covington's case, like, he wants to wrestle, and pretty much all his entries are based off of pure speed because he's just so far out. And once he touches the guy's legs or like locks up the body lock, they're down. He is like a plus wrestler in that sense. But like
No,
they have a
Tom. That's a good look. Ah. Anyway, well, we get oh, that's a terrible. Like, we need to screenshot that and make it his avatar on everything.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna get into 187 in a minute, but since Tom's cutting out, I want to talk about Bellator really quick, just because there are a few top prospects that were on that card. I haven't watched it yet. Shame on me because I talked about it going in, but I just didn't have time. I mean, the big ones to talk about were Caldwell, Halsey, and who was the
Neves?
Hmm? No, Neves. Neves Parsons, that fight. So, anybody, you saw the card. Anybody particularly impressed for you, Pat?
I thought Caldwell looked like he is pretty much where we would expect him to be at this point. I'm not convinced that he's like. Maybe this is just dumb bias on my part because there's been so much hype behind him for so long. But I mean, I thought he looked good, but he looked like where you would expect a guy with that kind of pedigree to be, not ahead of the curve. With that, I mean, he's still an awesome prospect, but not quite there. I don't know, but and then Neves reminds me a very great deal of Jordan Meehan, but not in a good way. Like where he's clearly trained with guys who aren't the very elite, or with non-elite kind of training partners, and he's so used to being able to blow through everybody that his process can be a little janky. Way too much high-risk stuff. Just a lot of bad habits that are really harder to get rid of than I think a lot of people think they are. Like, it takes a lot of time working under really dedicated coaches to get rid of that.
And yeah, Tom, anyone that you were particularly impressed with off that Bellator card?
I thought Darian Caldwell did a really good job. It wasn't the most impressive fight in a sense, like he didn't blow through Rafael Silva. But, I mean, you're not going to blow through Rafael Silva when you're as young in your career as Caldwell is. The fact that he got a win there and I mean, like, was fairly dominant in that win, like, controlled a good portion of the fight there, pretty impressive considering he's really young. I heard a lot of chatter about people not being impressed with him in this fight, and I think that kind of ignores, like, what we always talk about, the aging curves in MMA and, like, the fact that he's, like only 2 years into his career and he's fighting a dude that's been in MMA for like almost a decade or over a decade at this point. It's the kind of fight you expect prospects to lose, and he passed that particular test with flying colors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh yeah, no, I think Tom is giving the more realistic version. I don't know, for whatever reason, I have never been all that high on Caldwell, and that's probably some sort of implicit bias on my part. I would be more inclined.
Oh, jeez. Now we're getting the great Patrick cutaway, where he gets the stupid look.
How much of my thing did you miss? Because I was like talking for like 2-3 minutes there, and then I was like, why did everything freeze?
So probably at least half. But we talked over you, so don't worry about it.
Oh, fantastic! It was very insightful. You guys missed it. I'm never going to be able to replicate it again.
Yeah, we're saying, Pat, now you have the stupid looking avatar that we need to freeze for all time's sake. But oh, geez.
Yeah, I don't know. That's my computer freaking out. I don't even know why that's happening.
Okay, well, we're having all sorts of fun here. Jesus Christ, this thing is a fucking mess. Okay, so our show is way off the rails here.
There's like a whole little. It's like a flip book of Pat down at the bottom.
Yeah. Okay. So the fight I want to ask about then too, on the other flip side of that, with the Julio Cesar Neves, is how did Jordan Parsons do? Like, is he anybody worth watching?
I mean, I thought he looked pretty good. I mean, kind of grindy, but durable and mean and willing to get in there and mix it up. Big for the weight class, strong. I liked his takedown game. I don't know if he looks like an elite prospect or anything like that, but he's very, very solid.
Yeah, I thought he looked solid in this and handled Neves pretty well, in the sense that he kind of took the early storm and then ground him down and just kind of stole the will to fight out of him, and generally just like it was a good tough performance for him. So I don't know if I'm like excited to watch him fight again, but he's definitely a guy I'll keep an eye on and see how he progresses.
The only other things off that card that Brandon Halsey got to win. I don't know. He's definitely he's probably the first middleweight that Bellator has ever had that could actually develop into a seriously top 5 middleweight potentially, just because he's got the size too. Unlike Lombard, who, while being a very good fighter, dropped down after a couple of ugly fights in the UFC. And then Curtis Millender appears to be still kind of floundering. He was a guy that, I love his physical tools, but he obviously needs so much work on his game.
Well, yeah, and again, he's like what, 2 years into his career at this point.
Yeah.
Physically really talented, and just got swooped up by Bellator, and they're just giving him tough fights. I mean, he's getting really tough matchmaking, and he's a guy that's trying to develop like a very reach-based outside striking game. Doesn't have much in the way of grappling, and I feel like that kind of game, it takes a while to develop. I mean, even in the terms of MMA development, his game's going to get better with age. I kind of see him being like a guy who in 2-3 years from now is starting to hit his stride as a fighter and more of a technical, I think his ideal is to be kind of like a technical outside savvy sort of striker in the end.
Well, given where he is right now and the kind of tools he has right now, if he can get the right training, the eventual hope for him would be that he turns into an Anthony Johnson-like talent, because he's got the physical potential and the kind of power, that kind of raw physicality. But at the same time, we saw how long that took Anthony Johnson to do.
Yeah,
that was 7 years in.
Big for welterweight. He's a big dude. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Pat.
I mean, I think there's something to the argument that outfighting takes a really long time to kind of get to the point where you're comfortable doing it, where you're throwing enough volume to consistently win decisions, where you've got enough different tools in your wheelhouse to stay out of trouble. Like that, it takes a long time to get to that. Like, look at how long it took Anderson Silva to figure out how to be a really, really elite out fighter. Those are just a couple of examples. But George St. Pierre too always had the benefit of his takedown game. But from a pure outfighting perspective, like it took him probably 4 or 5 years to get to the point where it looked to me like he was really, really comfortable doing nothing but striking on the outside for extended periods of time.
Yeah, and I think the other thing we need to say about Milliander is that if he's going to develop in that way, he needs to get in a pretty top flight camp. I mean, like the dude started out in a UFC gym, and I don't know where he is now, but I mean, like he needs to find. I mean, like I think at this point, like your comparisons to Anthony Johnson, I mean, like I think Black Zillions would be like the ideal place for him, and the style he's going to have to develop is going to take a fair amount of nuance that you're not going to get at like average MMA gym.
Yeah, it's true. If you want to be that kind of fighter, there are only there are only a handful of camps that can really turn you into that kind of fighter, and it's going to take a long time. And he hasn't had the right start. It would be more. There might be more easy potential there if he'd had to start like what's that kickboxer Muay Thai guy that we've been talking about, the featherweight up from Canada? Really electric prospect, Canadian Muay Thai.
Hakeem Dawodu?
Well, yeah. If
Hakeem
you
Dawodu.
yeah, Dawodu. If he'd had that kind of start where you can't, he obviously, where you had a serious investment in your striking skill at non-MMA gyms, then breaking into the MMA scene and not being maybe at the biggest camp in the world is going to be a lot less of a problem than when you're somebody like Milliander who's coming in as an MMA native and trying to learn all the parts at camps that just aren't that great. So.
Yeah, we had a discussion a while back about the difficulty of coming in with no base at all and trying to turn into an elite fighter. And I think that, we've had a lot of discussions about this, but I really think, like, it's really, really hard to come in with nothing. Like, you better have started when you were 14 or 15 if you're going to make that your base. Like, otherwise, there's just so much to learn. There's so much to learn. That it's that, like, what we see from prospects who have that base, the just a pure MMA base. We talk about the usual prospect submission loss, right? Guys who athletic guys who get kind of overpowered by a big, strong submission grappler and they get caught in a scramble. Pure MMA prospects tend to have a different kind of growing pain loss, and it's the one where they just run out of ideas, like where it becomes clear that we've reached the limits of everything that they know and they have nothing else to offer. Rory McDonald versus Carlos Condit kind of fell into that category for me. Like, yeah, he was finished late, but like basically by the third round, Condit had seen everything that Rory knew how to do. Had seen absolutely all of it. And after that point, then he could start to plug away in the holes that were just so manifestly there. And unless you're going to be in the game, it's going to take you 8 or 10 years to get to the point where everything functions together the way it's supposed to. Like, the learning curve is just much longer for a prospect like that.
Yeah, I would co-sign on this in the sense that, like, you think about anyone who's trained anything, you think about all the nuance there is to grappling or all the nuance there is to striking, and then you do that for like a little while, and then inevitably most people who do like some striking or some grappling in like kind of the context of knowing about MMA, you cross-train at some point, and then you get a sense for the nuance and the depth in that other, realm. Like I've done some striking, and I have a much greater appreciation after having done that for how complicated striking is. And then you think about, or you actually try mixing them together, and you start doing something like an MMA, or in my case, doing something like a combat sambo, and then it gets so much more complicated when the more variables you throw in. And think about learning that from the start. And like guys like Milliander, who's starting as already an adult, it's going to be a very, very difficult thing to learn and develop like a deep technical base in that quickly.
Yeah, I mean, the classic case I look at with a guy like
Be a
Millender,
long
who who also has a really long path to being successful, is the recent UFC signing Ben Wen, who's somebody who started training back when he was like, I mean, his first fight recorded was like 2006, maybe even I think there might be one recorded somewhere else like 2003 or something when he's like 14, you know. And so he's already been in the game for almost a decade, and his process is still just all over the place, constantly problematic, constantly needing work. And he's had an MMA career under his belt already with a bunch of losses in it because he just started out, I want to do MMA, and didn't have a gym that was going to actually teach him good MMA. So
Yeah,
it
yeah, it's
takes
a
time.
problem.
It's a problem. It's a problem when looking at prospects like Millender. You end up with that problem. You end up with guys where you're like, "Wow, you're a physical freak, and you have all the tools you need to be a successful fighter, except skill, and that's going to take forever." Um, so let's take a look ahead at UFC 187. There are a few interesting prospects on here. The big blue chippers are Colby Covington and Islam Makhachev. They're the guys that are really like, I can't wait to watch them fight. Especially Makhachev because he's making his debut and he's got a fight against Leo Kuntz ahead of him that he should win. But he's kind of, I think of him as Khabib Beta, you know, which is still a damn good fighter. Not being Khabib Alpha is still, there's a lot of room to be a great fighter without being quite Khabib Nurmagomedov.
They have essentially the exact same skill sets, except Makhachev is probably a little further along as a striker than Khabib was when he debuted, and Makhachev probably has a little less in the way of.
Oh boy, it's one of those days.
Oh,
can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey.
It makes the similarity makes sense given that they've both been trained by Khabib's father since they were little kids.
Yeah.
So he is literally the lifelong friend and training partner of Khabib. So it makes sense that they have essentially the exact same game. Lots of clinch takedowns, just a suffocating top game. Really, really, really skilled and talented. Next generation kind of MMA wrestle grappler.
And then Covington, we've already talked a little bit about. He reminds me a little bit of like what you'd get out of Patrick Cummins had he come into MMA 5 years sooner. That seems like the fighter we're looking at.
Yeah,
and there's a lot more for growth there because of it.
I think there's a ton of room for growth with Covington. I mean, he is an exciting takedown finisher. If he gets in and grabs your leg or gets the body lock, you're hitting the floor pretty dramatically. And once on top, he's super aggressive. He's high. He keeps the attack on, which is something I always like to see in prospects, and something that I always kind of notice in elite fighters, that there's never a moment of rest with elite fighters. They're always hitting you. They're always working for something, and Covington kind of has that. He's another guy coming out of Central Iowa, community college, which has just become an utter factory of MMA talent. My concerns with him are very much on what's going to happen when he faces a guy who's pretty savvy in the striking game and in kind of takedown prevention, because he relies a lot on speed to get inside for his takedowns. And what's going to happen when the angles are wrong, or you have a guy that is able to take advantage of that distance. And he really hasn't faced that guy yet. In fact, I would venture to say that the majority of his competition in MMA has been against pretty trash fighters. One of them being Jay Ellis, who's one of the U.S. regional scene jobbers out there. I think he's sitting at on his shirt out there. He's 12-57 at this point professionally, so he's getting paid. He's he doesn't have quite the fame that Bob Sapp has, but He's getting there. I think Mike Pyle is going to be an awesome test for Covington. It's going to answer a lot of the questions. This is a fight I'm really looking forward to, and I think Covington, like the room for growth on him is pretty astronomical. I think he could be a pretty outstanding fighter.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason why Central Iowa has become such a factory for MMA fighters is because it tends to get guys who didn't get good grades or who otherwise had serious or who had otherwise like serious disciplinary problems. Like Covington is one of those guys. Like the reason that he had to leave Iowa is because he like got in a fight or had a DUI and his blood alcohol was over 0.2, and then I think he got arrested again when he was at Oregon State. And obviously John Jones has had his own issues, but like I think that's part of the reason why it's such a factory in general. But yeah, I mean Covington is super talented. Like if you can stuff his takedowns, yeah, he doesn't really have a whole lot to fall back on. I don't think he's quite as physically overpowering as somebody like Chris Honeycutt, who Bellator signed not that long ago. Like Honeycutt, when he gets his hands on you, just tosses you to the ground and beats the shit out of you. Covington takes you to the ground and authoritatively slams you to the ground, but then he doesn't have quite the same thunder in his ground strikes. He more like wears you down and wears you down and wears you down, and then the finish presents itself later in the fight.
Yeah, I mean, the big question I think that'll be answered by fighting Mike Pyle is if Mike Pyle survives past the first round, how much trouble can he give Colby Covington late? Like, if Covington gets tired, how much more predictable will his takedown game become? At which point, somebody like Pyle, who's not bad at anything, might be able to, make this fight really ugly.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, the other. I mean, and this is kind of a case of like a prospect getting bumped up the ladder too much too soon for somebody I think the UFC thought was going to develop faster than he was, and I'm sure he thought he was going to develop faster than he has. And that's Justin Scoggins, who's now kind of hit the big setback early in his career and should have a fight he can win against Josh Sampo on his hands. It's a good, scrappy, more his speed fight. But Scoggins, I remember when he came into MMA and came into the UFC, and my whole fear of his was like, he's got this fun and funky striking style, but how much is that really going to hold up in the UFC? And I'm not sure that it's it seems like it's almost becoming more of a problem. That like the higher competition he has to face, the less he's able to show himself off as a really good striker, and the more he has to rely on being able to out-wrestle his competition. And he's not the world's best wrestler. He's not a bad wrestler, but he's not an amazing wrestler.
Yeah, I think with prospects like Scoggins who come in and they do really impressive things really quickly, it's really, really easy to underrate how raw they actually are. Because this is one of those things that we literally just talked about this. When prospects like that are successful, you don't see the limits to their skill sets. You don't see just how shallow they actually are. And while I think Scoggins wrestled in high school and he did traditional martial arts and whatnot, like those are still not particularly deep skill sets. You don't have the same wealth of technique available to you that somebody who comes from like a real professional Muay Thai background, or who was an All-American wrestler, or was a successful jiu-jitsu competitor. You just don't have the same depth of technique available to you. You don't have all the ideas. And I think that we saw the limits of that for Scoggins when he fought Dustin Ortiz. I still scored that fight for Scoggins. I thought it was kind of not a robbery, but I definitely thought that Scoggins won that. But then again, Moraga, he went in there, and I thought he was he was pretty much out of ideas by the time Moraga hit that guillotine. Like, it wasn't just that he got caught; like, he was kind of out of things that he knew how to do against a much more experienced competitor.
Well, yeah, and then he put himself in that guillotine multiple times, and you can't put yourself in a guy's submission multiple times and give him like multiple looks at it and expect to get out of it every time. I think Scoggins. I mean, he's got some of the natural skills you look for. He's got a really nice sense of how to enter the clinch with a strike. Like he's one of those guys that like as soon as he's in the clinch, there's a pretty nice knee, or like on the way out he throws a hook, or like just good kind of like in scrambles he lands really nice punches, and those are good things to see. Instinctually, I think that's there, and obviously he's a pretty good athlete. He's still pretty young. I see striking wise, like a lot of disconnected parts in his offensive striking game. Likes to throw like a spinning back kick out of nowhere sometimes. Like throws a lot of single strikes, or like two punch or two strike combinations, and doesn't really seem to like ever be really setting anything up. And then on the defense side, really his only tool is distance and angles. He doesn't have like a second layer of defense, so once that fails, he becomes really, really hittable. So I think he needs to just
No.
think about these guys.
Shit, this whole thing has just been a shit show. Well, we're running out of time, so I'm gonna kind of like speed us through this. But yeah, oh, and I just lost Pat now too. Fucking hell. Um, so yeah, Scoggins is a guy that's got some stuff to prove. He's got some moves to make. Especially I think it's the danger of somebody who comes in who spent a lot of time in a striking system that is not really preparing elite fighters for the UFC. I mean, it's good that he's got those pieces, and I think it's great that he's moved on to a big camp to put polish on all of that. But I'm now talking to myself, so we are not at a successful show level right here. Um, yeah, I'm looking to wrap this thing up. So,
Oh my God, Pat dropped too. I thought it was just
yeah,
my joys of a 10-year-old wireless
no.
router here.
And so I apologize to other people who've had to put up with all of this technical bullshit from us, but the last person, people I really want to talk about here at all, we got Namajunas versus Ansarov, and that fight for me, that's a battle between two really two fighters at a very similar place in their career. One of whom I think is working a lot harder to change the problems in her style than the other. And surprisingly considering that Ansarov is the one at ATT, I think Namajunas looks like she's making more of the proper strides to change problems in her style and the things that she's struggling with. Like, her loss to Esparza wasn't good, but like I saw more attempts to be a consistent fighter. Like, I don't know. I have a lot more hope for Namajunas than I do out of Ansarov, who I think just there seem to be these gaping fundamental flaws that I'm not sure are going away. Mostly the fact that she can't maintain range, and when she gets inside, her default is to start going for high risk spinning strikes that don't put her in any kind of good position to stay off her back. I don't know. Anybody have any thoughts on that?
I think Namajunas is. I feel fairly good about her moving forward just because of the level of athlete she is, and she legitimately enjoys fighting and seems to be very she's very immersed in her game, as you said, and I think she's a fighter that I would very much expect to see take strides and take the lessons from her losses, where I'm not very sure Nina is kind of absorbing the same things out of her career.
Yeah. Yeah. What? Should I? Okay. So I think, yeah, I agree with that whole thing about Namajunas' athleticism. The thing that worries me about her moving forward is Pat Barry, honestly. Because like if you listen to that fight, the corner advice in that fight with Esparza, there's Trevor Whitman giving her really, really good advice. Use your jab, keep moving. Use your jab, keep moving. And there's Pat Barry. Throw the head kick, Rose. Throw the head kick. Like, when at that point in the fight, the very, very last thing that Namajunas needed to do was be tossing head kicks at somebody who was having success at grabbing her kicks and taking her down. Like, that was really dumb, really bad advice. And I know that Pat Barry loves Rose Namajunas, but what he might need to do for her to become an elite fighter is just like not be giving her advice about what to do during fights.
Especially because especially because he's a figure that she's going to listen to. Like, she's going to listen to him probably before she's going to listen to Whitman. That's the problem.
Yeah.
When you talk to coaches about their process in the corner, one of the things that every good coach will mention to you is how much they focus on getting their fighters to listen to the sound of their voice,
Yeah.
and the way that they build on that in training by constantly talking, by constantly making themselves heard to the point where the fighter automatically responds to that. And that's not, but it's not a given that that happens. You have to work at that. And if Barry is in there as a competing voice, yeah, that is a legitimate thing to worry about. I really think that is.
Yeah, that's true. That is something I haven't considered because the Grudge Training Center actually does seem to me like a pretty good camp for like keeping fighters on a stable game. Like they tend to train their fighters pretty well, I would say. When I see fighters out of there, it's maybe they're not getting all the best fighters in the world, but the guys that go there, they don't seem they seem to develop well. They seem to develop their fighters decently and keep them in control. And so yeah, Barry might be the factor that's really like worrying because I mean it's not like he was terribly selective as a fighter. He's not somebody who you want to point you like, oh, I want to model my career off Pat Barry's career. But
Yeah, I mean, he just always kind of struggled with a lot of stuff that had to do with fight IQ, and it's harsh to say, but to be real honest, he's not the guy I want giving me advice mid-fight.
yeah,
I want Trevor Whitman giving me advice mid-fight because Trevor Whitman is a proven MMA cornerman with a long history of doing really good things with his fighters. So, I mean, but with that said, Nama Yunus is unbelievably talented. She could
yeah.
legitimately be the champion in that division at some point. I don't think that's an overstatement.
Yeah, I mean she's got lots of time too. That's the thing. Is that she came into to Tough with 3 fights under her belt and you know a year of experience. So she's got a lot more time to work on that and grow. And it just may be the natural growing pains of having to lose a couple fights before she realizes, you know, I actually have to focus on these specific goals in my career if I want to improve. She has to be the one to take control of that. So we'll see if that happens. I mean, I do think that there's a big chance of her improving just because, and like I say, Ansaroff, I'm not sure. She's a decent athlete, but there are a lot of things in her process that aren't well done, and she's had enough time under her belt now that I'm kind of wondering as a pro, like, are you improving these holes or not? So I don't know. Anyway,
It's definitely a fight that's designed to make Nama Yunus look good.
Yes.
it is. It's the kind of opponent that will give her a tough fight without giving her a fight, without being somebody that should beat her. She's not going to take her down. She's not going to grind her out. She's not going to wrestle her. She's going to try to stay at range and throw kicks and play right into letting Namajunas set up big strikes or set up her takedowns and set up her grappling. So it's a fight made to make Namajunas look good. On that note, I think we got to close the show. I got other stuff I got to run and do. So as much as I would love to get into maybe Moraga's weird, still developing opportunistic game, some of those other notes, we spent time on all the important stuff. Thanks for joining me. Once again, you can find Tom at TP Grant or TP_Grant on Twitter, Pat at Patrick_Wyman on Twitter, me at DZane Simon on Twitter, Pat at Sherdog, Tom and I at Bloody Elbow. And on that note, give us a thumbs up if you like the show, and we got to run. So thanks for joining me, man.
Read my story on Deadspin.
Oh, yeah. Pat on Deadspin. Read that. Before we stop, remember Pat Deadspin. Pat Deadspin. Deadspin Pat. Pat Deadspin.
Read the story.